Okay, well, Tom, welcome to Somaya High Camp here in Annecy, France.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for stopping by. Today, everybody, we have Tom Livingstone with us, and he's going to tell us a little bit about who he is and what he does and how he got into climbing. So tell us a little, Tom.
Yeah, my name's Tom. I'm 34 and I'm originally from the south of England, but now I live here in Chamonix in France.
Nice.
And it's a good place to be based, but I grew up on the sea cliffs of the UK, which are great adventures, even though they can be between 10 and 100 meters tall. They're tiny on a world scale, but you can pack a lot of adventure.
Yeah.
Often they're trad protected. And so I spent my childhood being outside with my siblings and lots of camping and walking, and I'm sure we didn't really enjoy it much at the time, but now I'm appreciating it more and more, to be outside doing all these sorts of activities, but on a very low level, climbing and swimming in the sea and stuff. But for some reason, I'm not sure why exactly, climbing was the thing that I enjoyed most, and from about 14 years old, it was something that I applied myself to.
Okay. So what types of climbing are you really passionate about, or what do you like to do the most these days?
I enjoy all forms, actually. I think I could be left alone in a climbing wall or just with a single mountain, and that would suffice. But I've found that trad climbing, sport climbing, and Alpine climbing are the things that I enjoy most. But that encompasses enough for several lifetimes, so that keeps me busy.
What about giving us a little bit of an idea of like maybe your 3 most important climbs that you've done in your life?
Well, it is
however you want to define important.
It is very difficult to choose.
Yes, of course.
But if I was to sort of stereotype a trad climb, it would probably be on a sea cliff, because I think you get great ambience with the waves crashing in, and it's a very natural environment, so it's really nice. You can go for a swim if you get too hot and bothered. Yeah. And a place that I really, really enjoy is Gogarth. It's in North Wales in the UK, and so that's a sea cliff which is very typically with quite good holds but slightly overhanging and quite good gear, so it sort of encourages you to keep going, and you've got, despite all this intimidating atmosphere and the crashing waves and the wind and everything, you're still on quite good holds, and you're still sort of, well, I should just make a few more moves. And so that's a really boiled down but very enjoyable trad experience that I have.
Nice.
And sport climbing, well, I was recently in Seyouz and in the south of France, and so that's absolutely incredible. Yeah. Just that sweeping wave of limestone, and that's great fun too. You can try as hard as you like. There's no danger of falling off. Not much danger of falling off, and excellent quality of climbing as well. And then for the mountains, well, anything that's a culmination of all of those experiences is something that I'm interested in. You know, I like one pitch, but what about doing 2? And can you do 3 and 4? And I quite like to take the difficulty of climbing, or the challenge, both physical and mental, and to do more and more. And so that naturally led me to the mountains, where you can do as many pitches as you like, or as many combinations as you like.
Sweet. All right, so if somebody was going to go climb on the cliffs, the sea cliffs in the UK at this point in time, is there anything in particular they should know about climbing there that's different maybe than anywhere else?
Well, the UK is absolutely amazing, but there's always a but. Unfortunately, there's a lot of little tricky things that make it difficult. For example, it could be tidal. There could be a bird ban for half of the year. It could be very difficult to get in conditions. It could be raining on occasion in the UK, not so much. And so you really have to be patient and passionate about it. So I think that's really helpful. I also think that I realise how lucky I am to have grown up climbing in the UK, because all that trad climbing gives me a great mental experience, and it makes you very good at placing gear, and you can naturally take that to the mountains. So I brought a few props with me today.
Oh, great.
Sorry, that was not very smooth. It was right there.
Yeah, it's funny how much you learn from trad climbing versus, clipping bolts in some respects, right? Because it's a totally different mental exercise. It's a totally different way of climbing because there's a different problem to solve. It's not just clip and go.
Yeah, yeah. When you put that in and then you start climbing above it, you get very scared. But it does make you climb in a different way. It does train you. You get very good in the UK at placing all these little bits of gear and hanging out and going up and down and all this sorts of stuff, which actually translates really well to the mountains. So I think that was very formative to grow up in the UK.
Yeah. So now let's talk a little bit about the mountains, because that's a whole different level. And I think that's where we really want to explore a little bit with you. So what kinds of projects, or how do you pick projects to do in the mountains these days?
Well, as I said, I enjoy all sorts of activities. So it could just be along an aesthetic ridge line, for example, or it could be just a single pitch of difficult climbing. As I said, though, the great thing that I'm attracted to is to take those difficulties of places like the Alps or the Canadian Rockies or Alaska, and to try and take that to the altitudes like 8,000 meters, to try and supercharge that to 8,000 meters is in some ways a really interesting idea, but in other ways it's completely crazy, because of course you couldn't take exactly the same difficulty, but what if you could push it as far as you could go? What if you can really take like the challenge of technical, interesting climbing and take that to high altitude? How much could you push it? How much could you perform? And so I enjoy, as I said, it's more the climbing aspect, not necessarily the snow walking or non-technical side. Some of the experiences that I've had in the past have been really formative in building up to that, or they've been those sorts of things. I remember in 2019 I was on a trip to Pakistan, and on some expeditions we go for a known challenge. We've heard about this. It's an obvious thing that people have tried, and we know lots of information about it, and it's obviously going to be hard. But other times we look at the edges of the map and you think, well, what's over there? I don't know anything about that. It could just be one photo that you see, and you learn it's in an area such as this in 2019 on this trip to Pakistan, where it was right on the border with Afghanistan, so in a very wild area. Okay. And I climbed with a friend, Ali Swinton, and we were doing a new route on a mountain, and on something like our third or fourth day of doing some climbing to get up to a big wall, we were then, just as the sun was coming round, pulling on rock shoes, climbing this slightly overhanging rock, completely untrad, with this huge exposure, with the views of Afghanistan behind, and nobody else seemingly on the face of the earth except us. Wow. Just putting on rock shoes and getting really pumped really quickly. But suddenly you're like, oh, this is incredible to be doing all these types of climbing on one route, and then to get through this head wall and to go to the summit several days later. Well, that was a really special experience. That's the sort of thing that I like. And, imagine doing that to 8,000 meters. Would that be possible? It's something that I've been working towards for a few years. And last year I was very lucky to climb an idea of that, this concept of taking difficult climbs to high altitude. And that was with a Slovenian friend, Alej Čezen, and we climbed the west ridge of Gasherbrum 3, which was something that resembled this idea of a difficult climb to around 8,000 meters. I think at the top we could have almost jumped and touched 8,000 meters because it was 7,958 meters. So quite close. And that felt very satisfying to realize a long-term project, a long-term idea.
Interesting.
Yeah, we definitely fried a few brain cells up there, though.
I bet. So obviously that's taking, let's call it rock climbing or trad climbing, to a whole different level, literally, in altitude. But so how do you prepare for something like that? How do you go about researching and preparing and figuring out what tools you need to go do that type of thing? Like,
I think that it's a huge question. One of the ways that we can do that is through gaining lots of experience ourselves over years and years, and building up slowly. I think progressive steps are very important. To try and reflect on each of those steps is useful too, and to learn from other people's experience, talking to older climbers or to those who have done or try to do the things you're interested in. And then also making some mistakes, but crucially learning from them. The Alps is a fantastic playground where you can do any combination of any number of things. And you can realize, okay, well, I did push that too far, or actually I could have taken less, or needed to have taken less, for example. So there's a great testing ground here in the Alps. That's not to diminish the Alps at all.
No.
Because it's very serious. But it's a great place where you can try, and then every year I like to do an expedition or a couple of expeditions to other places and try and build on that experience.
Yeah. So, how does the gear that you get and you work on, or you try to help build, play a part in that success, or at least being safe in doing that type of thing?
I think the gear is incredibly important in these sorts of things. If we look at what's been done in the mountains in the past 100 years, you would be very impressed by what people have climbed, but also you would realize that there's a quantum leap between what we have now. So I think it's really important to recognize how good the gear is, but I think it's absolutely crucial if you're arriving at a steep pitch of climbing and you don't have your rock climbing shoes, or you don't have your technical ice axes, it's going to become 5 grades harder. Yeah. But conversely, if you've got the right piece of gear, it allows you to keep going.
Yeah. So at climbing, let's call it rock or alpine rock at those altitudes, is there anything that's vastly different than even here in the Alps? As far as the challenge or the tactics or the tools or how you do it, or is it just approach it and go and climb like you normally would?
There's not too much difference with rock climbing, except for the consequences, and the risk level becomes very quickly, a run out here in the Alps is not the same as a run out in Alaska, for example. Right. I've found, though, that mixed climbing is a little more secure in some ways. You can often encounter less of a quick escalation of fear. And interestingly, on Gasherbrum 3, for example, we had a lot of hard parts, but we had some snowy parts. And we just kept falling through the snow. And you think, what is going on? This is snow. It should eventually support me. But because of that altitude, the snow didn't transform into, solid, normal, snow. Yeah. It was just incredibly difficult to move up a simple snow slope. Yeah. So even that, I think, was an effect of being at that altitude or being in that environment.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, so obviously here at Somaya, we like to make gear. We make tents, we make backpacks and things like that. Can we talk a little bit about what types of those tools do you like to take in those types of climbs, and maybe some of the elements that you're looking for in choosing those materials or those products?
I will often take a tent, and that is because I will often end up sleeping. Sometimes I like to go as fast as I can and very light and not sleep, but when you start going into these places like Alaska or like the Himalayas, you often encounter bigger mountains, harder conditions, and I'm more attracted to the things that are going to take me more time. Yep. That's not to say that others can't do it quicker, but especially when you're the first person up, you don't know what you're going to find. Yeah. So that way I often end up taking a form of shelter. And for me, the most enjoyable and reliable form is a tent. Sure. And something like the single wall 2-person bivvy tent is all you need. Again, it's such a feeling of comfort to be in a tent in a storm in an unknown place, but it's also such a simple, fragile thing. Nowadays we're taking these things that are less than a kilo. We can take incredible technology built into this tent, and it suddenly changes a really serious or an unpleasant situation to, okay, well, we're out of the wind, we're out of the bad weather, we can make some food, we can keep moving upwards. Yeah. So tents are fundamental in keeping the situation under control and being able to climb upwards.
Yeah. I think we also talked a little bit earlier about the idea of the tent being a way to kind of almost recharge and get ready for the next day. That's such an important part. And to have that confidence that you're going to be protected and have a good sleep and be ready to go for that next day.
Yeah, exactly. So if you sleep well, you're going to perhaps wake up and want to go up, whereas for sure if you sleep badly, you're going to want to go down.
Yeah. So the other thing we talked a little bit about was this idea of like, some people like to have their tents with the tent poles on the inside. Other people like it on the outside. Do you see advantages or disadvantages to either, or what do you prefer and why?
I can see that everyone has their own opinions about these things. Yeah. Mine is generally that it's easier just to put up the tent in the quickest, the simplest way, especially with wind or bad weather in the mountains. Yeah. For me, that means I put the tent poles on the inside, and I think the main advantage is it's quicker. You don't have to try and find the pole sleeve, and then inevitably the pole sleeves will jam at some point. So putting the poles on the inside is a nice, simple way of doing things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. I know, like, you were part of very close in the development of our new Alpinist tent. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of how did that passion for you come about, and how did you get involved in that whole process, and what were the things that you really wanted to see happen with that tent and its next generation?
I do find equipment to be very important, as I said. It's not the be-all and end-all, but especially in the areas that we're working in now, the potential and the change that we're seeing is very impressive. So I enjoyed working with Somaya on the creation of the Alpinist2 Ultra tent. Good name there. Yeah. And for me, I thought it was very important to have some basic features, things that you could use even in a storm or with your gloves on. Okay. The basic concept of having a big door that you can jump in and out of. I will often take aluminium poles as opposed to carbon ones if it's a multi-day climb in an unknown place, just because they are more reliable, for example. However, technology in the carbon poles is improving rapidly now, so it's great to see, and I have less fear of carbon pole snapping, which is great. Yeah. I've spent perhaps 4 years working with Somaya on the Alpinist tent, and I'm really pleased to see where it's come to now. I think it's very, very impressive, and I can honestly say that. I was a little hesitant from year 1 to year 3, but now I'm really impressed to see this tent. To me, it represents a pretty much perfect Alpine tent. Okay. Of course, there are always ways that you can improve it, or we can end up not taking it and going faster, but I think it's at a good stage.
So the latest iteration, what are some of the elements that are in that version or features that you really were advocating for, that you felt were important, and why?
Everything from the simple function of it. Okay, how big does it need to be? Okay. How big does the door need to be? Does it need ventilation? How impressive can this fabric be compared to others? Why should we choose this fabric? That was the broader questions that we were asking. And then the second thing was, okay, well, how can we make these features usable in a mountain environment, which is perhaps one of the worst that you can think of. You're completely breathless, and it's snowing on you, and it's miserable. So, for example, everything from how the zips work and what type of material they are and whether they will snag into the shelter of the door, is that important? How can we make it so that we can put skis or ice axes as anchor points? So it's important to have larger pieces. Whether it's essential to have things like guy lines to anchor the tent, and generally it is, even though they always catch and get in the way. And whether the ventilation should be at both sides or on one side, and whether it's necessary to have a tent that squashes you down because it's small, or in fact, is it better to have something that if you're going to sleep a whole week in, can you fully lie down, can you fully spread out, and can you sit up in? So those are the important questions that we were answering. Okay.
So I know a lot of times we're always thinking about that balance between durability and weight. And for you, like, where do you draw that line? Like, if it's too ultra lightweight, it's too fragile, and if it's too durable, it's too heavy. Like, for you, how do you pick between those two things? What's your philosophy behind that?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because I would choose weight slightly more weighted than durability. I would choose it as slightly more important than durability. But I do understand that nowadays it's not very appropriate to make a single-use item, and it's better to try and think of something that will last the average person for a long time. You don't want to be buying a tent that costs more than €1,000 every day.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So it's a balance.
Yep.
You can be unlucky and just snag a tent on a rock and unfortunately cause a hole, but then you can always repair these things.
Right.
But for me, I think function and weight are the two most important things, and durability is quite a bit lower.
All right, that sounds good. All right, something a little bit more fun. What's your favorite food to eat when you're on an expedition or out there in the mountains?
Well, whatever the chef is cooking is fine by me, because
Okay.
I'll eat kind of anything.
All right. And what about entertainment? Are you a music person, books? What do you like to do?
I really enjoy writing and reading,
Okay.
and so I really enjoy having that time on a trip through pleasure, just to write more and to read more. So I'll definitely take several books or a Kindle or something like that on a trip. And you can, get really interested in the local geology, for example. In Pakistan, there's all these huge glaciers with all these weird rocks on them, and you think, well, how on earth did all of these weird rocks get here, right in front of me? But yeah, generally I like to also explore the local cuisine, which can be a bit dangerous at times.
That's good, though. That's how you learn, I guess.
Yeah.
What about, is there a favorite piece of gear that you could kind of always take with you on trips? It's the first thing that goes into your bag.
Well, I really enjoy, sorry to give difficult answers, but I really enjoy tailoring what you will take to the trip and vice versa. But there is something that I will often take. So if I'm going to be bivvying, I'm probably going to be taking a tent, and then I'll probably be taking a sleeping bag. Yep. And by far the most efficient thing that I've found over the last 15 years is a double sleeping bag, which was custom made for me by Mountain Equipment, which was very kind. And that is a game changer. It makes it two persons warmth, but with the weight of one sleeping bag. So that's absolutely fantastic. It's pretty intimate, but that changes a lot. Yeah.
Excellent.
But I mean, you can get as silly or as interested as you like. I mean, there are many things like the no-make ice axe, which I really prefer. Or there's, being a pasty Brit,
there you go.
you can avoid the horrible sun by wearing your hat umbrella.
Oh, that's amazing.
So this is, it's ridiculous, but I really do get sunburnt completely.
I believe it.
So it is kind of serious to try and avoid getting burnt to a crisp. But it's also a good little reminder to not take things too seriously.
That's cool.
It is all just fun, and it is all just climbing up rocks and coming back down at the end of it. So the umbrella hat is very useful. This is just a piton that some friends gave me, but it is actually a Slovenian piton made in a factory in Slovenia, and is a nice gift that Slovenians will often give you. I've gone on a lot of trips with Slovenians just because it's worked out like that.
That's great.
And so it's nice souvenirs that they will give you, and then you'll use it, but it'll have some sentiment behind it. So that's quite nice. For sleeping and bivvying, I think it's really important to have a stove like this, which you can hang as well, because that's really, really important to be able to cook at the same time as lying down or being in the tent. It's not you have to be very careful, because it's a dangerous environment to cook in. But really useful tips that I've learned over the years are things like having a hanging kit for your stove, so that you can cook like that. Is to have perhaps a small plastic tub, like an old tub from somewhere, and that way you can put snow into the stove without getting your hands wet or your gloves wet.
That's smart.
And it weighs a few grams, but you can be making sure that you don't get cold or wet hands like that. Yeah. So that's really useful. There are some really niche things, like if you're having a bivvy on an ice field, then you can use something like this. This is a snow hammock, so you kind of make this big banana-shaped hammock underneath where you want to put the tent, and you fill it with stuff, and so suddenly you've got a decent place to sleep as opposed to a miserable place to sleep. I think Raf Slowinski and Ian Wellstead were very happy to have one of these on the ascent on K6 West. So when you see people like that use it, you think, okay, there's a lot of rationale behind it. That's very important.
For sure. I love this. This was amazing, by the way. That was
It's embarrassing,
perfect.
but it's essential.
No, it's cool.
I mean, I'm already red and it's raining today.
No, that's cool. And I like the little tip around having something else to be able to fill up that with snow.
Yeah.
Have you seen the little cup that MSR makes that goes underneath that stove?
No.
It fits perfectly in that, and that'd be the perfect thing to be able to do that
Yeah, that's good.
with, and it stacks perfectly right on the bottom.
Okay, nice.
I don't know if you've seen that yet, but it's
No.
it's literally designed to be a
Okay.
bowl that fits around this surface
nice.
perfectly, and it'll protect your heat exchanger
Oh, that's good.
and all of this stuff in here.
Nice. Nice.
So at one point, you kind of started working with Somaya on the Alpinist tent, and so you kind of tell us the story of how you started, kind of what you had in the beginning and where the product was, and what were your kind of the first requests or changes that you were asking for, and then you had how many different prototypes with us? Maybe 3 or something like that. So maybe take us through each step of like where it started, what you asked for, how it changed, what the next steps were, and just kind of help us understand the story of how everything evolved to kind of where it is today, and hopefully if it's where you like it or if there's still things to do.
I could see that there is a lot of potential in the tents specifically for alpine climbing. And so I was really interested to work with Somaya on this process. Initially, we worked on things like the Radical 2 and the Assault 2, which I think had great potential. The materials were interesting, and Somaya clearly had a great understanding of what was required. But I found that the designs were just not quite on the mark. And so through an earlier prototype in roughly 2021, I was very I was very happy to give feedback to Somaya on all these sorts of things, and I hope it was well received. It's always an interesting thing to offer your opinion because it is someone's opinion. Through that, we then developed most recently in last couple of years what is now the Alpinist2 Ultra, and that I was really, really happy with. I've used that tent on Pakistan trips such as K7, on Nepalese trips, and also on Gasherbrum 3, amongst numerous bivvies in the Alps and Alaska also as well. So the idea was still to take this very simple design, but to improve it with things that we could use in any weather, things that we could use for a long time, and features that would last and be useful. Now I think the latest iteration is very impressive, and yeah, I think that it's a good balance between weight, durability, and function. Of course, we could make a tent out of tissue paper, but it wouldn't be so warm, and it wouldn't be so comfortable, and it would flap noisily perhaps. But I think where we're at the moment is a very good 2-person bivvy tent for the mountains. I have squeezed 3 people into it before, but I wouldn't recommend it.
So for you, can you tell us a little bit about why you would want the current, let's say, Alpinist2 Ultra versus the ASO 2 Ultra or a Radical, let's say? What about that particular tent, or what features of it are really better than the others for your type of climbing?
I found that there are a few features in the Alpinist that are nice and simple, and the other tents just didn't quite have that simplicity, or they tended to go over where we were looking for. That's not to say that they were too much, but for example, having a third pole on the roof area of the tent is interesting because it creates higher volume and because it creates good ventilation, but again, it's superfluous to alpine climbing. Small details like the zips always catching in the storm flaps were very annoying as well. I find that having the poles inside the tent is very simple and just works. Perhaps it's not the way, but I've found that it's by far the easiest way to put up a tent in a storm, basically. So that works quite well as well. Those are the concepts. Keep it simple, improve what we've already got as well, and trying to make good refinements through the tent process, rather than just make something which has a lot of good features, but is not necessarily what we're looking for a simple, lightweight shelter for alpinism.
Yeah. I think you're defining simplicity in the same way a lot of alpinists look at it, which is let's strip away everything that's superfluous and have the most minimalist product that will do the job at the lightest weight, possible. So.
Yeah, it is easy to prioritize weight, but it must be done carefully. For example, I used a couple of tents which were very small in height and in volume, and they were just not practical for two people to climb day after day after day
Sure.
In the mountains for. So it's not necessarily weight at all costs,
right.
but it is very important, yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, like that concept of spending multiple days in a row in the mountains in a tent. Like, that's a really interesting criteria. Like, at what point are you going to choose something that's lower volume, and at what point do you want to have that larger volume a little bit? And what is the real benefit in your mind of having a little bit more volume in those kind of longer trips?
I think you can cut corners or skimp on one night. And if you know that the next day you're going to be sleeping in your bed or something like that, then that's fine. But beyond that, you're quickly going to be uncomfortable or not recovering or not recharging well.
Sure.
If it's several nights, I think it needs to be as close to a comfortable island of calm, and so that's where it becomes more important to have something that is longer lasting. Same with the carbon poles versus aluminium poles. Carbon poles have never snapped on me yet, but I'm very worried that the day they will, it will be fairly catastrophic, whereas taking aluminium poles gives you an extra margin of safety.
Sure, makes sense. Yeah, we were talking about this the other day here at the team, is that the concept that an alpinist tent is almost like a cocoon. Like, it's this thing that we get inside of, and it's protecting us from the world around until we're ready to, come out and fly, again. Let's say. So that's really cool. Excellent. Yeah. Well, for me, climbing really has a lot to do with this ideal balance between the physical activity and that kind of mental problem solving. I really enjoy that kind of back and forth, having both aspects of it. For me, things like road running or cycling, it's physical only, and there's not that mental side of it. And so I don't get as much out of those activities as I do for climbing. For you, is there something more that you take away from climbing, that you find that really draws you to it and keeps you coming back? Is there something that about being out in nature, being in the mountains, that you really kind of, it recharges you, or it inspires you, or it changes you?
I do find that the challenge of climbing in all its forms is something that I enjoy. It could be just bouldering, or it could be alpine climbing, but certainly I enjoy it, as I said, when I can do more of it, and it's a test over several hours or days or something like that. I also enjoy getting to the top of something. That's a very satisfying experience, and having some amazing views with a very good friend or a very good partner as well. Those are important. But yeah, I think for me it's a culmination, and if I can sort of test myself physically and mentally and pass the test, then it's a very satisfying feeling. As you say, it could just be trying to sprint as fast as possible on the road, but something about that doesn't quite seem to be the same as climbing.
Okay, great.
There are a few other things that I really enjoy on trips, and that is to download a couple of DJ sets from Boiler Room or something like that.
Nice.
And so there's some amazing techno or electro music that you can download, and you can be in these beautiful wild places and put on a good pair of headphones. That's a very good experience, and then that also gives you something to look forward to when you get home.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great idea.
On a trip that's, say, 2 months, or a really long time, I will spend almost every night sleeping on the ground, and you'll have this sort of bubble above you, but you're always sleeping on the ground, and it's just a funny thing to realise that wherever you go, you sort of just eventually, you lie down, and then you put a bubble over this person, and that's it. It's almost, you could go anywhere, and there you go. Here we're in this little bubble, and it's quite funny that suddenly this is now home, and this is now a comfortable place. Yeah. If we were just lying on the ground, without that, it would be cold and look strange. But we're sort of literally connected to the ground. Yeah. We're sleeping on the ground, wherever we are on this trip. It could be traveling to
Yeah.
the mountains or in the mountains. Yeah, it's quite a funny little thing, you know.
Yeah.
Imagine all these just people with this little
Bubble.
dome-shaped thing over them.
Interesting. Ah, cool. Well, thanks for sharing that.
I also feel lucky to have grown up in the UK because there's a real culture amongst climbers. It's a very friendly atmosphere, but it's not one of beating your chest, or it's not one of making a big deal out of what you've done. And I really appreciate that humility that
Yes.
we can bring into the mountains. I've climbed things which have been much harder or easier than other people, and so it's very difficult for us to take a climb in the mountains and to make it a level playing field. So if we follow that, then it's not very correct of me to shout about my experiences and how easy or hard I found it compared to another person.
Right.
So I really appreciate that atmosphere of enjoy it, don't make too much of a big deal out of it. And I think that the ethics that we have in the UK are quite strict.
Oh, yeah.
If you go climbing in Scotland in the winter, it has to be winter, basically. If you go trad climbing, there are ethics around that as well. So I appreciate that there's this sort of attention to detail and to try and keep climbing, particularly alpinism, in this fantastic space that it's in at the moment, to sort of protect it, to keep it a special activity.
Sure.
If we're allowed to just sort of tap out and take a helicopter to the top whenever we like, then it ceases to become an interesting experience.
Yep.
So I think that there's something very simple about keeping climbing there's something very simple about keeping climbing just as this activity, which is, for example, us two and the mountain. And it's not a fight, it's not a combat, and we're not going to become victorious at the top. But it is just like a trust in each other and meeting the mountain on its own terms. And if we're not good enough, then we can come back another time.
Yeah. How do you think that kind of culture and that those ethics evolved in the UK climbing community? Like, where did that come from? I think, you know, obviously I'm an American, so we have adopted a little bit of that same kind of trad mentality. We don't want to go out and put bolts next to cracks that can be protected, et cetera. So, but my guess is, and I don't know this for sure, but a lot of the way the American culture developed around that ethic probably came from the UK. And I'm just curious, do you have any sense of why that developed that way? Did the community just decide that's the way we wanted to do it? Was it about protection of the environment, the purity of the sport itself, or the challenge? Any idea how that came about?
I think there are three reasons why we're like that. The first is because we don't have giant mountains or cliffs, so we have to protect them for what they are. Because if they all become indoor gyms, or if they all become very easy climbs, then we'll have nothing else. Right. They're also very well protected with natural gear. They're cracked. We won't say loose, but they're all cracked. There's lots of places where you can protect them naturally with trad climbing equipment. The second is banter. And I think there's a great culture in the UK of friendly abuse, let's say, which encourages, to keep you humble. It's your friends taking the piss, let's say, that bizarre expression, to try and keep you on a level playing field, which I think is very important.
Okay.
And the third thing is, because we don't have these big cliffs, because we don't have the Alps, we're sort of this weird island which is a bit of an underdog. And it's the same with Slovenia. It's an underdog country, and I think that puts you on a really good playing field, or it puts you in a really good mentality. Sure. You don't have expectations. We're going to climb in our home areas, or the Brits are going to go climbing in the Alps. Everyone expects us to not understand much about alpinism, and it's true that at the start we don't. But quickly we can take those skills that we have and get all right at it. So I'm not going to say we're going to get good, because, keep it level. But I think having those low expectations is really useful, both for going climbing here today, tomorrow, but also on an expedition. I think it's really, really important to have clear goals in your head of what you love to do, but go with very few expectations. And I think that helps with new routes in the Himalayas as well, because you can go around the corner and see a perfect crack system that you can climb, or you can go around the corner and see something that's too difficult. So being able to react and change and adapt with what you meet, I think is very useful, whilst sort of having this expectation of, okay, well, there's no pressure, we're just going to give it our best.
So that's a really interesting point. So I was just thinking that humility that comes from that culture and that community, how do you take that into these projects where you have to be bold and you have to push a little further? You have to kind of say to yourself, that's more than what I've done before, but I have to find the will, the desire, and the confidence to go do something a little bit harder. How do you take that humility that's part of that culture and then push that limit a little bit? What is your way to kind of push through that threshold, or is it just natural? You see something, you're like, no, I can do that.
I think there's two different things. One is the self-belief or self-confidence, and that is very important. But it's the way that you communicate the experience that is where humility is important.
Right.
I think, yes, self-belief or self-confidence is very important on a big alpine route. You have to believe it will go, you'll find a way through. But also you have to think, when I get down, I'm not going to call this the next best, greatest thing. Even if you truly believe it was difficult for you, perhaps other people will do it with no hands or hands in the pockets.
Sure, of course.
So I think it's two different things. I think self-belief is very important. And again, I think self-belief is based on your experience. So that's why this step that you're about to take is a logical next step. Okay, I have done trad climbs, or I have done alpine climbs which have been in this genre.
Yep.
This is not a quantum leap that I'm trying to attempt. It's the next step. And that's fundamental in taking it.
Yep.
But yeah, then how you convey it when you get home is up to you. But I think it's useful to have a bit of that. Makes
sense. All right. What about choosing partners for some of these big projects? Do you have like a criteria that you're looking for in someone else that you're working with? Is there a personality type? Like, is that an important part of your process, or is it just whoever's available and can get the job done with you?
I think going with a good partner is essential. It's an activity where you trust your life with someone and vice versa. And so I have a few partners that I will often climb with, and that's a friendship and a partnership developed over many years.
Sure.
In some ways it's very simple, in other ways it's very difficult. When you're with the right person, it just clicks and it's all nice and simple, and you can still make jokes and make light of the situation.
Yeah.
And you know that you can both take the lead at certain times. But it is something that's quite rare. There aren't many people that want to do the sorts of things that we're interested in. So you do have to sort of work those partnerships. And I've climbed a lot with friends in the UK and friends from Slovenia, just through the climbing world, and also, friends in France now. It's great to build those partnerships and to try and keep going. But yeah, you have to also understand other people aren't going to be quite so interested in doing crazy activities all the time, perhaps, or you learn from when they're backing off, or learn from when they're pushing on.
Nice. So if you had a young climber in front of you today and they were saying to you, like, okay, Tom, I want to do the types of things you do today, like, what advice would you give that person? Again,
it's very easy and very difficult. Through my work at the Young Alpinist group, a group of 10 individuals who are around 20, 25 years old, based in the UK. They enter a 3-year program and they receive mentorship, funding, training, and that's creating a pathway for knowledgeable and safe climbers. That's a great environment, I believe, where we can create that motivation and create the next generation. But the simple answer to the question is just go climbing. If you enjoy it, you'll naturally keep doing more and more of it. But the difficult answer is, okay, well, you should spend the next 5 or 10 years trying to climb as much as possible in the mountains, in many different weathers, in many different styles, with many different partners. You should try and be quite reflective and analytical of your equipment and of the way that you climb. Play to your strengths, work on your weaknesses, perhaps quit your job, live in your van, travel around Europe as much as you can, climb in the UK, things like that.
Yep.
very easy to
Great advice.
to give
Nice.
advice like that.
Excellent.
Difficult to do.
Yes. Easier said than done.
Yeah.